Most people who stay inside a single income stream don't do so because they decided to. They do so because they delayed. And the delay had a structure, not laziness, not a lack of ambition, not an absence of awareness that a second income would be valuable. A specific set of conditions that made starting feel premature, conditions that kept renewing themselves year after year, until the window that felt like the right time to start never quite opened. The first condition is the threshold illusion, the belief that starting requires reaching a certain level first. Enough savings, enough time, enough stability in the primary income, enough knowledge about what to build, enough confidence that the thing being built will actually work. And these requirements don't feel unreasonable. They feel prudent, like responsible preparation before making a move. But the threshold keeps shifting. The savings get allocated elsewhere. The time stays compressed. The stability feels perpetually provisional. The knowledge never feels complete enough. The confidence waits for certainty that never arrives. And so the start keeps being deferred to a future moment that has everything the current moment lacks. A moment that never comes. The second condition is the comparison problem. Most people's first exposure to what a second income looks like comes from the extreme end. The business generating significant revenue, the real estate portfolio producing passive income, the investment account large enough to live off the returns. These are real, they exist, but they represent the mature, developed version of something that started much smaller. And comparing the starting point to the mature version produces a gap that feels insurmountable. Not because it is, but because the intermediate stages, the early, messy, small producing stages, are invisible in the narrative. Nobody documents the beginning when it looks like nothing. They document the outcome when it looks like success. So the perception of what starting requires is calibrated to the wrong reference point, and starting feels like it requires access to something that isn't currently available. The third condition is the cost of waiting. Waiting feels neutral, like maintaining the current position until the conditions improve. But waiting has a cost. Every month of delay is a month of compounding that doesn't happen. A position started small today and held consistently for 5 years produces a different outcome than the same position started 2 years from now. Not because the position is dramatically different, because the time is. And time is the engine of compounding. Waiting doesn't preserve optionality. It consumes it. Each month that passes without a position being started is a month of compounding that can never be recovered. The delay mechanism isn't irrational. It's a reasonable response to how the starting point has been framed. Too large, too complex, too dependent on resources not yet available. But the framing is wrong, and the cost of the delay, in time, in compounding, in positions that could have been building while everything else stayed the same, is the most expensive part of never starting. More expensive than a bad start, more expensive than a slow start, more expensive than starting small and building gradually towards something that compounds. Because a bad start can be corrected, a slow start can be accelerated, but the time lost to waiting doesn't come back. If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video, subscribe. More clarity is coming. The barrier to starting a second income is almost never what it appears to be. It appears to be capital, resources, time, a specific skill or asset not yet possessed. But the actual barrier, in most cases, is the perception of the threshold. The gap between what starting is imagined to require and what it actually requires. And that gap is almost always significantly larger in the imagination than in reality. What does starting actually require? At the most fundamental level, it requires one thing: a deployable unit of something. That something can be capital, a small amount deployed into a position that begins to produce a return. It can be a skill, an existing capability that can be structured outside the employment context, applied independently, traded directly without the intermediary of an employer. It can be time, discretionary hours directed toward building something that has the structural properties of a system, something that produces without requiring the same input every time. In every case, the deployable unit is smaller than the threshold illusion suggests. The capital threshold is the most misunderstood. Most people believe that meaningful capital deployment requires a significant amount, enough to generate returns that feel worth the effort of managing, enough to justify calling it investing rather than just saving, enough to produce an outcome that looks like the examples they've seen. But the purpose of the first position isn't to produce a significant return immediately. It's to start the compounding clock. A small amount, deployed consistently, even a fraction of what feels significant, begins compounding from the moment it's deployed. The return is small. The position is small. The impact on the monthly financial picture is minimal. But the clock has started. And the clock is the asset. The skill threshold works similarly. Most people underestimate the market value of what they already know. The skills built inside employment, the expertise developed over years of doing a specific thing well, have value outside the employment context. Consulting, freelance work, contract engagements, knowledge-based services applied directly to people who need what you know. The skill already exists. The market for it exists. The only thing that doesn't exist yet is the structure that connects your capability to that market outside the employer relationship. Building that structure is the work of starting, not acquiring a new skill, not reaching a new level of expertise, structuring what already exists in a different way. The time threshold is the most honest barrier. Time is genuinely constrained. The labor system consumes most of it. What remains is discretionary, and discretionary time has competing demands. But the amount of time required to start a second income is smaller than the amount required to develop one fully. Starting doesn't require a significant reallocation of time. It requires a consistent small allocation, protected deliberately, directed at something specific. 2 hours a week, applied consistently, over months and years, produces something. Not immediately, not dramatically, but structurally. And structurally is the only way anything that compounds gets built. The threshold was always lower than the delay suggested. The starting point was always closer than it looked. The first stage of income diversification doesn't look like financial independence. It doesn't look like a business. It doesn't look like a portfolio. It doesn't look like anything that matches the finished version of what it's eventually building toward. It looks small. It produces little. It requires more effort per dollar than the primary income. And it exists alongside everything else, not instead of it. That's what the first stage actually looks like. And most people never start because the first stage doesn't match the image of the destination. The first stage has one structural requirement. It must be separate from the primary source. Not a promotion, not a raise, not a performance bonus from the same employer. Something that produces from a different structure entirely. Because the purpose of the first stage isn't the income it generates immediately. It's the architectural shift it represents. Moving from one source to more than one source. From full dependency on a single point to partial redundancy. Even if the second source is producing a fraction of what the first one produces, the architecture is different. And a different architecture compounds differently over time. The first stage also has one behavioral requirement: consistency over intensity. The instinct when starting something new is to apply significant energy in a short burst, to treat the early stage with the same urgency that a deadline or a crisis produces. That approach works for some things. It doesn't work for building income structures, because income structures compound, and compounding is a function of time, not of intensity applied in one period. A small, consistent input, sustained over years, produces more than a large, inconsistent input applied in bursts, because the consistent input stays in the position, keeps compounding, keeps building the structure through the periods when motivation is low and the early results feel insignificant. The inconsistent input produces results during the burst, then stops, and compounding stops with it. The size of the start matters less than the structure of it. A small position in the right structure, deployed consistently, held through the early stage when returns feel invisible, builds differently than a larger position in the wrong structure, abandoned when the early results disappoint. This is why the first stage is less about finding the right vehicle and more about establishing the pattern. The pattern of starting, the pattern of consistency, the pattern of building something outside the primary source and maintaining it even when it produces almost nothing at the beginning. Because the beginning is always the smallest part. Compounding makes the beginning look insignificant in retrospect, but the beginning is where the clock starts. Most people never get to see what their second income could have built because they never started it. Not because they weren't capable, not because the resources weren't available in some form. Because the first stage looked too small to be worth starting, and they waited for a stage that felt more significant, while the compounding clock that could have been running stayed stopped. The first stage is always small. That's not a reason to wait. That's just what every large position looked like at the beginning. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something.